The torches flickered, throwing long shadows across the shiny marble floor as she walked barefoot toward the wooden figure in the corner. Her hands shook with fear. Behind her, 7 witnesses stood silently, their faces lit by small lamps, their eyes watching every single step she took. They had told her this was tradition. They had told her every bride before her had done the same thing. They had told her refusing would bring shame to her whole family. But no one explained what the tradition actually required. Not until this moment. Not until the cloth was lifted. Not until she finally saw what waited underneath. It was the year 89 CE. During the rule of Emperor Domitian, 18-year-old Flavia Tirsa was about to learn that Roman marriage was not the beautiful saffron veils or the scattered walnuts she had seen earlier in the ceremony. What happened behind closed doors, what happened in front of witnesses who could later speak in court if needed, was something Rome's own writers struggled to describe, something the Christian Church would try for centuries to erase from memory. But before we move any deeper into this story, I truly want to know something. Where are you listening from right now? It amazes me that a ritual from 2,000 years ago can reach people all across the world today. Leave a comment and tell me. The wedding procession had been beautiful in its own way. Flavia wore the bright flame-colored veil that marked her as a bride. Her hair was styled in 6 braids tied with wool ribbons, exactly how tradition demanded. The sacrifice at the temple had gone smoothly, the sheep's organs showing good omens. Her father had signed the papers that moved her from his legal power to her husband's, using the ancient words that made the marriage official. She had spoken the ritual phrase that generations of brides had repeated, Ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, where you are Gaia. Those words meant she no longer belonged to herself. She now belonged to her husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years older than she was, a man she had met only 3 times before this day. But that ceremony was only the beginning. What waited at the end of the long, torchlit walk through Rome's streets? Inside a house she had never seen? Inside a room already filled with witnesses. That was where the true change would happen. That was where she would learn what Roman law expected from a wife's body. The crowd surrounding the procession had sung rude, dirty songs as tradition required. The verses were crude and detailed, describing exactly what would happen to her that night. Young men shouted things that made her cheeks burn beneath her veil. Her mother said the purpose was to scare away evil spirits using laughter and embarrassment. But Flavia saw something else. Her mother had cried while doing her hair that morning, and her final words had been whispered like a warning. Do not resist. Whatever they ask, do not resist. It only makes everything worse. They reached Marcus Petronius Rufus's house just as the sun fully disappeared. Wool and green branches decorated the doorway. 2 torches marked this as the place where the marriage would be completed in the eyes of the law. The crowd grew louder, the songs more shocking. Someone threw walnuts at her, the shells getting tangled in her dress, a blessing for fertility that felt more like a joke. Her husband stood waiting in the doorway. Behind him, she saw shadows moving. Too many shadows. Far too many for what should have been a private moment between a new husband and wife. Marcus lifted her over the threshold because tradition said it was bad luck for a bride to trip when entering her. And because long ago, Brides had been carried into their husbands' houses, whether they wanted to enter or not. The door closed behind her, blocking out the crowd, and Flavia finally saw what waited inside the atrium. An elderly woman, in formal clothes, the pronuba, stood there, ready to control everything that would happen next. A priest of unknown kind, 3 female slaves carrying bowls and cloths, an older man with a leather bag full of medical tools at his feet. And in the corner, covered in fabric, stood a wooden structure almost 4 feet tall. The pronuba stepped forward and took Flavia's hands. Her grip was strong, almost holding Flavia in place, as if she expected Flavia to run. "Welcome to your husband's home," she said. "The holy rites must now be completed. Here is something almost no one tells you about Roman marriage. It was not about romance. It was a property transfer, just like selling land or a ship. Roman law called it conventio in marriage. A woman moved from her father's ownership to her husband's. Long ago, this transfer was absolute. A husband had the same legal power over his wife that he had over his slaves. Even in theory, the power of life and death. In Flavia's time, the laws had softened. Women could own property, and divorce was possible. But the main idea stayed the same. Marriage moved a woman from one man's authority to another's. And like any major property transfer in Rome, it required verification. Imagine how Romans sold land. Witnesses watched the deal. The land was inspected. Rituals asked for blessings. Documents were sealed. Everyone knew exactly what was being exchanged. Romans used the same logic for marriage, but with one huge difference. A bride's main value was her ability to give birth to legal heirs. Her body was the property being transferred. Her fertility was the resource being bought. And Roman law required both to be checked. This is not guesswork. Roman legal texts clearly say a marriage was not valid until consummated. And the consummation had to be witnessed. Otherwise, how could anyone be sure it happened? A bride's virginity had to be confirmed. Otherwise, how could the husband be sure future children were his? These requirements created specific rituals, rituals that made sense to Romans, rituals that horrify us today because their logic feels so foreign, so cold. The pronuba led Flavia toward the covered figure. Flavia's heart pounded so loudly she could hear it. The pronuba's hand stayed tight on her arm, guiding her, allowing no escape. "You must greet Mutinus Tutinus," the pronuba said. "You must ask for his blessing before your husband comes. You must offer yourself as tradition requires." Flavia lifted the cloth with shaking hands. Underneath was a wooden figure carved in the shape of a phallus. Not a small charm meant to protect children, not a garden statue. This one was large, carefully sized, clearly made for one horrifying purpose. And that purpose became clear as the pronuba calmly explained what Flavia must do. Mutinus Tutinus was Rome's god of fertility and sexual beginnings. Many ancient writers mention him, but always briefly, always with discomfort. Saint Augustine, writing centuries later, could barely speak of him without anger. He said Roman brides had to sit on the wooden phallus of Mutinus Tutinus as a sacred duty before joining their husbands. This ritual happened in front of witnesses. Augustine hated Roman religion, so maybe he exaggerated. But his words match older texts written by non-Christians. Lactantius said the ritual was so shameful that even saying its name made the speaker dirty. Arnobius described brides made to straddle the god's symbol while their husbands watched. Varro, writing much earlier, mentioned the god using careful words that hinted at physical contact without. Some modern historians try to soften the story. They say maybe the bride just sat lightly on the statue's lap. But the ancient words do not support this easy explanation. Augustine's word meant to mount. Arnobius's language suggested more. Lactantius refused to describe the details because they were too shameful. The public reason for the ritual was to ask the god for fertility. The private reason, the one Romans didn't say out loud, was to prepare the bride. It broke her resistance. It showed full obedience in front of witnesses. It trained a young virgin to accept what was coming next. Flavia stood frozen. The pronuba placed her hands on Flavia's shoulders, guiding her, positioning her body the way tradition demanded. The witnesses watched. Her husband watched. The physician waited for his turn. And Flavia finally understood her mother's tears, the dirty songs, the warnings. She now knew what being a Roman wife truly meant. In theory, but saying no would bring shame to her family, cancel the marriage contract, send her back to her father as damaged goods. No honorable man would marry her after that. Everything she had been taught about honor, duty, and obedience would crumble. So she did not refuse. After the ritual, slaves washed her with scented water. The washing had religious meaning. It purified her after meeting the god. But it also prepared her for the next step, the medical examination. The physician stepped forward. This examination was not optional. Before any important Roman wedding, a bride's virginity had to be confirmed. The examination was recorded, and that record became part of the legal papers showing her value. Roman medical texts described these examinations with cold, clinical detail. There was nothing gentle about them. The first exam proved she was. Now, after the ritual, the physician checked again, confirming the ritual had been completed as expected, confirming her body matched the earlier exam, confirming she was ready for consummation. All of this happened in front of witnesses, who might one day have to testify in court. What shocks modern readers is not only the invasiveness, but the casualness. Romans did not think these rituals were cruel. They believed they were simply necessary steps in a legal transaction. The bride's feelings did not matter, just like land or a farm's feelings did not matter when inspected before sale. Property did not feel. Property was transferred by correct procedure. After the exam, Flavia was taken to the bedchamber prepared for consummation. The room was decorated according to tradition. The marriage bed was placed so it could be easily seen from the open doorway, which would stay open all night. Oil lamps gave enough light for the pronuba to watch. Slaves waited quietly in the hallway. Marcus entered. To Flavia's surprise, he looked nervous. She had expected confidence, command. Instead, he looked toward the pronuba awkwardly before moving closer to the bed. The pronuba spoke in a ritual tone. "The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be completed according to the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify. Let no one doubt that this woman becomes a wife tonight." What followed took hours. The Pronuba watched everything, sometimes giving commands to make sure the act matched legal requirements. The door stayed open. Sounds drifted into the hall. Everything that happened in that bed was semi-public. A verification ritual to prove the property transfer was real. At dawn, the physician returned for one final exam. He confirmed that the consummation had taken place, that her body now showed the changes marking her passage from virgin to wife. The Pronuba gave her testimony. The legal transformation was complete. Flavia Terza was now a Roman wife. She would have 4 children in the next 10 years. She would run her husband's household with skill. She would attend festivals and do everything expected of a Roman matron. And she would never speak of her wedding night, not even to her daughters. Because what could she say? It was tradition. It was the way things had always been done. It was what being a Roman wife required. Her silence was not unusual. It was universal. Roman women did not write about their wedding nights. Roman men did not describe what they saw. The rituals were so normal that talking about them was unnecessary, like talking about breathing. Everyone knew. No one spoke. This is why rebuilding this history requires fragments from angry Christian writers, from quiet legal notes, from medical texts filled with embarrassment, from artwork that only makes sense when you know. The silence was not a conspiracy. It was simply how deeply woven these practices were into Roman life. They were everywhere, unseen because they were ordinary. For 1,000 years, this was Roman marriage. Generations of women lived their wedding nights inside this system. They understood marriage through this lens and passed on knowledge in whispers to prepare their daughters. The system survived because its logic made sense to Romans. Property must be checked. Transfers must be witnessed. Marriage is a legal deal. Women are how families continue. The logic was neat and tidy and horrifying. The end of these rituals did not come from inside Rome. It came when Christianity reshaped Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, bringing new beliefs. If women had souls equal to men, they could not be treated as property. If marriage was a holy mystery, it could not include actions the church viewed as shame. If modesty was a virtue, the entire system of open doors, witnesses, and ritual examinations became unacceptable. The change took centuries. It was uneven, but slowly the old ways were erased. Statues of mutinous Tutinus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night rituals were destroyed or allowed to rot. Paintings showing the traditions were covered with plaster. The Pronuba's job became simple and symbolic. Within a few generations, almost no one remembered what Roman marriage had really involved, except scholars studying faint, broken clues. The Christian leaders who erased these rituals were not only hiding embarrassing stories, they were trying to build a new world on top of Roman foundations while pretending the old foundations never existed. They succeeded so well that most people today have no idea what Roman weddings truly were. But fragments remain. Flavia died in the year 131 CE at around age 60. She had been a wife for more than 40 years. What did she think about her wedding night all those years later? Did she remember it with pain, with acceptance, with something in between? Did she hope for something different for her daughters? Or did she believe this was simply the way life worked? We will never know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. Their silence is the silence of women whose experiences were not considered important enough to record. Their thoughts about their own bodies were not important to the men who wrote history. We know what was done to them. We do not know what they felt. But we know enough to understand why this history was hidden. It reveals something uncomfortable about the civilization. We imagine Rome as the foundation of law and culture, but the truth shows that civilization and cruelty can exist side by side. Rome was highly organized, highly intelligent, and yet deeply dehumanizing. The wedding night rituals are gone, but the women who endured them were real. Flavia Tirsa, her mother, her daughters, all the Roman women whose wedding nights were rituals of control. They lived. They survived. They were silenced.